A new rabbi arrived at the local synagogue to discover that whenever a prayer was offered in worship there, half the congregants stood up and half sat down. The half that sat yelled at those who stood, and the half that stood yelled at those who were sitting. Perplexed, the rabbi went to consult one of the founders of the synagogue, a 98-year-old housebound man. And he took a representative of each faction with him, hoping that they would discover the real tradition. As soon as they arrived, the member who stood during the prayer asked the old man, "Is it not the tradition to stand during the prayer?" The old man answered, "No, that is not the tradition." So the member who sat during the prayer exclaimed, "Then it must be the tradition to sit." And the old man said, "No, that is not the tradition." Frustrated, the rabbi said, "But the members of our congregation keep yelling at each other, arguing about whether they should sit down or stand up." "Yes," the old man said, "that is the tradition." Arguing is an ancient religious tradition. One might even call it a sacred ritual or a practice that has been highly valued throughout our history. That is why our Jewish ancestors preserved two different accounts of the story of creation, alternative versions of the Ten Commandments, and conflicting narratives of the life of David and Samuel and Chronicles. That is why the Deuteronomistic historian is challenged by the opposite perspective in the book of Job, and why we hear the voices of a multitude of prophets offering contrasting interpretations of imperial disaster and renewal. That is why we have four Gospels with various perspectives on the life of Jesus. None of the disagreements in the Bible are ever truly resolved. In fact, they are left intentionally unresolved to remind us that there is no one right answer, perspective, or way to believe. We are forced instead to wrestle with them all. Today we enter into another argument, a biblical and theological disagreement that had a tremendous impact on the history of the church and the world, a dispute between James and Paul. There was a deep conflict between James and Paul, and in our passage today we see James directly attack Paul in the most polemical way, quoting Paul's own words, criticizing his understanding of faith, and turning his arguments upside down. James said, "What good is it if you have faith but do not have works? Can your faith save you?" James knew Paul's famous expression, justification by faith. But James casted serious doubts on the effectiveness of faith alone, or faith by itself. And he argued that faith without works is worthless, lifeless, and dead. James even quoted Paul's favorite text, Genesis 15, and cited Paul's favorite hero, Abraham. But then James turned the story of Abraham on its head, proclaiming that it was not Abraham's faith, but his works that saved him. James was saying that if Paul really believed that faith alone could save us, then he was dead wrong. James should have won the argument. But not because Paul was wrong about faith, but because Paul never intended to set up a hard dichotomy between faith and works in the first place. Their positions were actually much closer than it seemed, yet sadly, James lost the debate. Even though his letter was one of the earliest written and contains almost the entire Sermon on the Mount, it was one of the last books included in the Bible. Things might have been different for James if the church had not accepted Augustine and Aquinas, who separated the body from the soul. But the nail in the proverbial coffin for James was the great reformer Martin Luther, who despised the book of James with a fiery passion. Luther called the epistle of James an epistle of straw and tried to get it removed from the Bible. He once even said that the book of James has nothing of the nature of the gospel in it. I guess he forgot about the Sermon on the Mount. Luther took Paul's words to the extreme, and James' faith in good works didn't really work well with Luther's doctrine of salvation by faith alone. Luther was clearly wrong about James, but he was a towering figure who gave birth to the Reformation and founded the Lutheran Church. His teachings were deeply influential for millions of Christians for generations, and theologies are not inconsequential. They have a long-lasting, real-world implication. And Luther's theology had grave consequences for the history of the church and Western civilization. His doctrine of salvation by faith alone went hand in hand with another doctrine called the two kingdoms, which contended that there is a worldly kingdom, which includes everything we do with our bodies, and a heavenly kingdom, which is where we live out our faith. And Luther claimed that the government has authority over our bodies, and the church only has jurisdiction over our hearts and souls. And this distinction that he set up then between works and faith played out and was mirrored in a sharp distinction between the worldly and the heavenly kingdom and between the body and the soul. Luther used this distinction between body and soul and works and faith to argue that a Christian should have no problem being an executioner who performs capital punishment, because that's an act that you do in the body, in the worldly kingdom, and it has nothing to do with your soul or your faith. In addition, Luther associated the Jewish people with the body and the worldly kingdom, and he was vehemently anti-Semitic. He wrote a 60,000-word treatise entitled On the Jews and Their Lies, which argued that the Jews were the devil's people, and advocated setting synagogues on fire and destroying Jewish prayer books and forbidding rabbis from preaching, seizing Jewish property and money, and smashing their homes. He called them envenomed worms that need to be forced into labor, expelled for all time, and that Christians were not at fault if they killed them. Luther's writings became a blueprint for Kristallnacht. And Bishop Martin Sasse, a leading Protestant leader, applauded the fact that this coordinated attack on the Jewish people took place on November 10th, 1938, which was Luther's birthday. The prevailing opinion among most historians today is that Luther's anti-Jewish writings contributed directly to the development of anti-Semitism in Germany, and in the 1930s, his words provided the perfect underpinning for the Nazi regime. Everyone who wrote against the Jews justified their arguments by referring to Luther, and every single anti-Jewish book printed during the Third Reich contained a quotation from Luther. When the Protestant churches issued a statement in favor of the policy of forcing Jews to wear the yellow star, they argued that Luther had already suggested preventative measures against the Jews. When James said faith without works is dead, he really meant faith without works is deadly. Promoting the spirit without the body is not just lifeless, it can have murderous consequences. So much of our history is the horrific story of what happens when the followers of Jesus separate faith from good works and the body from the soul. Patriarchy, colonialism, genocide, slavery, the Holocaust, apartheid, Jim Crow, it all stems from this separation of faith and works, body and spirit, which James warned is the form of hypocrisy. The famous evangelical preacher Dwight Moody once said, "I used to go to the poor with a Bible in one hand and a loaf of bread in the other. But I realized that the poor always looked first at the loaf, and that was contrary to the gospel, so I stopped carrying the loaf of bread." That is what happens when we focus on faith and reject good works, or try to save people's souls while ignoring their bodies. We play out the darkest parts of our religious story and participate in a deadly faith instead of embodying a life-giving faith of love and liberation for the world. It's been a traumatizing, painful, and emotionally exhausting week for women in our nation. As the media coverage of the Senate confirmation hearings for the Supreme Court candidate have been filled with the stories of women who have experienced sexual assault and abuse and were disbelieved. As a man, I cannot imagine what this week has been like for women. But no matter where you stand politically on the confirmation of this candidate, it is obvious that we have a serious problem in this country with violence against women, with patriarchy, misogyny, toxic masculinity, the objectification of women's bodies, and the denial of their traumatic experiences. If you are listening to this, and you or someone you love is a survivor of harassment, sexual assault, or abuse, I want you to hear these words. there is no excuse for what you experienced. Regardless of when it took place in your life or what the circumstances were, it is unacceptable. No matter what the situation was, and your story matters, and your body matters, and we believe you. You have the right to be angry. You are not crazy. You have nothing to be ashamed of. You deserve to be heard and respected. You are not alone. What happened to you is real. You are resilient. You have survived. You are still here. You are beloved. We love you, and God is with you. I know I speak for all of our ministers when I say that we will make ourselves available to you. We will listen to you. We will hear your stories. We will be here for you. Please do not hesitate to reach out to us. This church is called to be a safe space, a loving refuge, a sanctuary, and a safe haven, where women and all victims can find asylum and be free from harm, where their stories will be heard, where they will be trusted, supported, and loved, and where everyone who is hurt can find healing, wholeness, and peace. When I was just starting out as a youth minister, one of the girls in our youth program told me that she had been sexually assaulted. She'd been at a party drinking, and she was assaulted by her cousin. He was 21. She was 13. As she cried, she said she was scared that no one would believe her or even care because she was drunk when it happened. So I went with her to the police station to file a report. And then the senior minister and I went to her home to be with her as she broke the news to her parents. It was a soul-crushing day for all of us when her parents burst into two completely different but unhelpful reactions. Her father went and got his gun and got into his truck to go and kill the cousin. As a senior minister, had to go out into the garage and physically restrain him. Her mother, on the other hand, who I was sitting with, refused to believe her. The cousin was her sister's little boy, her favorite nephew. She didn't want to mess up the family. Walking with this girl through the legal trial, her struggles with her family, and the mental issues that she suffered related to the incident and her mother's denial throughout the rest of her life opened my eyes to how hard and dangerous it is for women to come forward and tell their stories about abuse and trauma. It requires incredible bravery. Christianity that divides faith from works or spirit from body cannot understand the history of women's oppression and exploitation, or why a woman's body is not an object for the fulfillment of a man's desires. Faith without works is deadly, and a disembodied faith cannot save us. I recently attended a retreat where the facilitator of the spiritual retreat quoted from two church fathers. The first was a man named Valentinus, who strongly believed that Jesus never went to the bathroom. Because to do so would be unseemly for a divine Savior. The other was Irenaeus of Lyons, who said, "The glory of God is the human being fully alive." The facilitator said, "The goal of the spiritual life is not to escape the materiality of our bodies or the things that make us creatures. The goal of spirituality is the flourishing of every aspect of human life and the restoration of all of creation. The implication is that there is nothing out of bounds for our spirituality. If it is human," he said, "it belongs." Stopping at the rest area on the highway, changing diapers, getting up at 6:30 in the morning to make lunch for middle schoolers, visiting a parent or a grandparent in the nursing home. It all belongs. When we live completely and fully in our heart, mind, and our bodies, our spirituality comes alive. Because if it's human, it belongs. In the midst of all the pain and trauma in our lives and in our world today, what brings me great hope are the shining rays of light that I see bursting through the darkness. And after turning Paul's words and arguments upside down and offering some challenging words of his own about deadly faith, James turned in a hopeful direction, I believe, to offer us an exemplar of holistic, integrated, and embodied faith. No, it wasn't Abraham, as you might have thought, that James held up as a role model. He only really mentioned Abraham in order to turn the tables on Paul. No, in fact, it wasn't a man at all who James lifted up as the image of an integrated and embodied faith. It was a woman named Rahab. And Rahab wasn't just any woman. She was a woman with the wrong kind of body. She was a Canaanite woman, a Gentile woman, who had the wrong ethnicity and the wrong religion and the wrong kind of body. She definitely didn't believe the right things or have faith in the traditional sense. She didn't have the right occupation either, did she? She was a prostitute, which means her body was constantly exploited in the patriarchal culture of the day and considered impure and unclean. And yet, James says to us in this text that Rahab is the one who showed true faith. So what is real faith then? Clearly, faith is not determined by what kind of body you have, but what you do with your body. The miracle of this story is that in far more repressive and male-dominated society than ours, James was not scandalized by the fact that Rahab was a woman, or that Rahab was a Gentile, or that she had never heard the name of Jesus, or the fact that she was a prostitute. All James cared about were Rahab's incredible good works. She risked her body and her life to welcome strangers from Israel and protected the lives of these strangers from the violence of her own people. She was the architect and builder of a safe space for people who were in danger, a loving refuge for the vulnerable, a sanctuary for fugitives, a home for those who were in need of asylum. Her bravery, her hospitality, her mercy, her sacrifice, her good works of love and peace made her the paragon of virtue and the exemplar of real faith for the early church. I say Christians who struggle to affirm the full humanity and dignity of women, or the ownership of their own bodies, or the integrity of their stories, would do well to reflect on the witness of Rahab, a woman who James elevated as the personification of a real and embodied faith. James was not alone in his assessment either. The author of Hebrews lauded her faith and hospitality as well. And if there is any doubt about her incredible significance for all of our lives, we would do well to remember that she is only one of the 4 women who Matthew names as the ancestors of Jesus in the genealogy and family tree. Maybe that's where Jesus got his hospitality from. Maybe that's where Jesus got his peace and his welcome and his compassion and his love from. His great, and on grandma, Rahab. The Canaanite prostitute with an enormous, expansive, and embracing faith that transcended 2 different religions and countless generations, a faith that still has the power to inspire us today if we are willing to let it in. What about us? What kind of faith do we want to have? None of us truly want to have the senseless and worthless or dead faith that James describes. None of us really want to have a deadly faith, do we? No. We all want a faith that brings life and love into the world, a faith that is filled with good works, a faith that unites spirit and body, a faith that cares for the bodies of others. We want a faith that lives with the conviction that what we do with the body, we do to the soul. We want a faith that believes the claim that when the body is honored, the whole person is honored. We want a faith where everything belongs in our spirituality, where every part of our creaturely existence is touched by the grace of God. We want a faith that not only seeks justice and loves mercy, but walks humbly with God. We want a faith that not only believes God is one and loves God with all our heart, our mind, and our soul, but a faith that loves our neighbor as well. We want a faith that welcomes the stranger and offers hospitality to others. We want a faith that embraces the wounded in a caring community, a loving refuge, a safe haven, and a sanctuary for all people. Isn't that the faith that we all want? If that is the faith that we really want, then we must turn and accept the witness of Rahab and so many other brave women of enormous faith. And we must listen to their stories. And we must follow their works of hospitality and love. And we must learn what it means to let them lead us out of the disembodied darkness of deadly faith and into a faith that is right and good and true. Amen.